Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in just a minute or two here, but if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, we're happy to be with you this afternoon. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute here, but in the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourself and say hi in the chat. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar and unfamiliar names. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, we are gonna go ahead and get started, and I'm gonna start by welcoming you all. My name is Rachel Stucker. I'm the Director of Housing Alliance Delaware, and excited to spend the next 90 minutes or so with you all here this afternoon talking about something that I think all of us know by now is one of the most important things we can talk about when it comes to solving our housing crisis, which is what we can do differently. Particularly with regards to land use, to make some changes in how we do housing in Delaware. We're really excited to welcome Alex Horowitz back to Delaware. I think many of us have drawn on his expertise here in Delaware over the last year or two, and we're happy to have him back for a webinar today. A couple of housekeeping items before I say more about Alex and hand it over to him. Please just make sure to keep yourself muted, but we do want this to be interactive. So if you have a question while Alex is presenting, please go ahead and pop it in the chat. Sonia is going to be monitoring the chat, and she'll make sure to wave at Alex and let him know we have a question, so we can get your question in there and have it be a bit more interactive throughout his presentation. So Alex Horowitz is the project director of housing policy at the Pew Charitable Trust. He guides research for Pew's housing policy initiatives, focusing on how home financing, the housing shortage, and land use regulations affect household well-being. He's also conducted extensive research on consumer finance issues, including how small dollar loans and consumer banking can be safer and more transparent. He also researches the way in which restrictive zoning practices drive up rents and ultimately drive up homelessness. Before joining the Pew Charitable Trust, Alex worked at the polling firm Hart Research, conducting strategic opinion research for clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. And he previously worked in media relations as well, baseball information and communications for the Miami Marlins and Cincinnati Reds. So if there's any fans here, cool, yay Reds, yay Marlins. And Horowitz also holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from Harvard University. And Alex, we are so happy to have you. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you to get started.
All right, sounds good. Thank you to the organizers. Thanks to Housing Alliance Delaware for hosting today, and nice to be with you. And as Rachel said, feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout. Don't need to wait till the end, because we're going to cover a lot of material today, and there is no need to hold off. But big picture, I am going to cover material around Delaware's housing shortage. And there's so much happening in the US right now. And we have so much kind of new information that wasn't available even a few years ago that I'm excited to share it with you and hope this can be helpful because things are pretty serious out there on the housing front, as you know, as we wrap up legislative sessions in a whole lot of the country. So overall, there's really never been a more expensive time for housing in the US. We've got half of renters spending more than 30% of income on rent. Delaware, it's a little bit lower than that, but still, for 44% of renters to be spending more than 30% of income on rent is quite a lot. That's higher than the historical norm. We've got a quarter of renters in the US spending more than 50% of income on rent. In Delaware, that's 22%. So when someone is spending more than 50% of income on rent, this is consequential. We're talking about increased risk of eviction, displacement, crowding, homelessness, because it crowds out the rest of someone's budget and puts them in a precarious spot. The main reason this is happening, why housing has gotten so expensive, is not because the new homes are expensive. The new homes are always expensive. It's that there aren't enough of them, so the old homes are getting expensive too. The housing shortage in the US of 4 to 7 million homes is the main reason why. Look, experts are using this range of kind of 4 to 7 million. We don't know exactly where the housing shortage is, how big it is, but it's not under 4 million. There's a pretty good chance it's over 7 million. So if it's not in that range, it's higher than this range, not lower. Some of what's going on is just that household size is dropping. And so we need more homes when people live in smaller households mathematically, because people in smaller households fill more homes. So the US household size is at an all-time low, 2.49. Delaware's a little lower even at 2.45. And while 63% of US households have one or two people, in Delaware that figure 64%. So the kind of housing that is the most undersupplied are smaller, well-located homes. Now, because there just aren't enough homes out there, rents have been going up. Because when availability rates get higher, rents go down. When availability rates get lower, rents go up. No surprise that when New York City has a median rent over $3,000 a month now, because the rental availability rate in New York City is at 1.4%. In places where the availability rate is higher, 9, 10, 11%, that's a different story. That's more of a tenant's market, so rents are going down. In a place where the rental availability rate is low, that's a landlord's market because tenants don't have options. So the question is always, are we in, if you've bought or sold a home, a buyer's market is when there's lots of inventory out there. A seller's market, when there's not much inventory out there. Rents work just the same way. So we're either in a landlord's market when there's not much available, or we're in a tenant's market where there are lots of homes out there. And with so few homes available, rents have been going up. In Delaware, we can see this throughout the state. It doesn't take that many people moving in from New Jersey, from the Philly metro, from the Baltimore metro, DC, New York metros, to take all the available housing in Delaware. And Delaware is not unique in this regard. There are other states going through the same situation. New Mexico, Montana was, Vermont had some of this too, where there's been some in-migration and not enough housing coming online. And that means that scarcity pushes up rents, pushes up prices. And this has been a problem in Delaware for a number of years now, but it's really gotten much worse in the last 5 years or so, as work from home during COVID and migration patterns put pressure on Delaware's available housing stock. Some of this is just that not enough homes are getting built. So look, if Delaware were building 90 homes per 10,000 population, where it was about 20 years ago, we'd be in a different situation. But that's just not the case. And so housing construction has never reached the level where it was 20 years ago and is well below it. And in most states, housing production is declining this year because interest rates were low in 2020, 2021, 2022. And as interest rates got higher, fewer projects penciled, fewer projects were financially viable. And so construction has been dropping. Now, there's absolutely a way to beat that and to get more housing online, even with high interest rates. But that takes a concerted effort and some policy changes. And so Delaware's housing construction is lower than it has been. And that shortage of new homes coming online means that old homes get bid up. So if we look at inventory, and goodness gracious, housing inventory is only at 38% of where it was in 2016. So with a 62% decline in the availability of homes to buy, no surprise, prices have spiked. And we see the median home cost in Delaware rose 55% from the end of 2016 to the end of 2024 and is now over $400,000. That's a tough pill to swallow. And it's no surprise that in the US, the average age of the first-time home buyer has risen from 29 in the 1980s to 38 last year. Yeah, please.
Alex, sorry, before you move on to the next slide, when you say housing inventory, do you mean housing production? Or can you clarify what you mean by
homes for sale? So
the number of homes per sale.
The number of homes for sale in the
Thank
state.
you.
Yeah,
Okay.
as a proxy for inventory. So, right, we know that if there's a lot of housing out there, that's a buyer's market. Most homes are in a situation where sellers are eager to find a buyer because there's so many homes out there. And homes tend to go below asking when you're in a buyer's market with lots of inventory. When inventory is only at 38% of where it used to be in Delaware, that's a seller's market. And so you're going to have multiple buyers looking at most homes, end up in bidding wars. But a 55% increase in home prices during this time period, that's indicative of a very tight housing market. And it's tough to get out of that without more homes getting built to create some inventory, especially because with most people who have been in their home at least a few years having a mortgage at an interest rate lower than where mortgages are today, they're reluctant to sell and take on a new mortgage at a higher interest rate. So that means we need new homes coming online, since not many sellers are eager to sell and give up their low mortgage rate unless they're going to be buying in cash. Rents have had the same experience. So we see rents going up 57% from the start of 2017 to this fall in Delaware. Same dynamic. Now, rents have been going up throughout the US, right? Delaware is not an exception here in seeing rents go up because of the housing shortage. But go back to the start of 2017, the median rent in Delaware was 12% below the US. Delaware was a fairly affordable state at that point in time, relative not just to the US, but to the states around it. New Jersey, Maryland, certainly New York Metro, DC Metro, within a couple hours driving distance. Now we look at Delaware now, median rent 6% above the US. So Delaware went from being more affordable than average to less affordable than average during this time period because of the influx of residents and the lack of new construction to supply, the lack of new construction to meet the need out there. And that's how we get this cutthroat competition. When there aren't enough homes out there, it's not that the new homes are expensive. New homes are always expensive. It's that the old ones are getting bid up. And a house that would have gone for $300,000 may now be going for $400,000 to $450,000 because too many people are seeking it since there aren't enough of them. So that's the bad news. We're going to move on to some good news because there are places that have figured out a way to beat this dynamic and are having success. I'm going to show you 4 jurisdictions from around the US that all did some version of the same thing. They all made it really easy to build apartments on commercial corridors, near jobs, near commerce, near stores, near transit, near schools. but mostly on commercial corridors so that people could get to stores and jobs nearby. These are often on bus routes. Minneapolis, New Rochelle, Portland, Oregon, Tysons, Virginia, all four of them made it easy to build apartments. And when they did, they saw their housing production come in at more than double the US. So they were adding between 7 and 23% of their housing stock during this 5-year period we looked at versus 3% for the US. And while rents went up 30% in the US, rents barely budged in these cities, Minneapolis, New Rochelle, Portland, Tysons. They all saw rent growth of less than 1% a year during this time period because they had so much new housing that they were adding, and it was the type that's needed most. Apartments that are well located, that are near the places people go every day, so that their housing doesn't drive up their transportation costs by pushing them into long commutes, pushing them into long drives to get to the places they're going. If we were doing this, 10 years ago, I would have said, hey, this is how analysts think the market works, but we don't have data from jurisdictions that have done it. Now we do. We have data. We see how it turned out. More places have followed and had the same results. So yes, this is how housing market works. And we have a question in the chat. There's a great deal of vacant houses in Wilmington, Newcastle that can be rehabilitated housing, but the powers that be do not know who owns them. Yeah, I hear that. So overall, the vacancy rate is low in the US and in most markets where prices are rising. But there are absolutely questions, and there are vacant houses that can be rehabilitated. Sometimes the rehab costs are more than the home would be worth. And in that case, there are other solutions for dealing with this, like enabling multiple homes on a lot or using factory-built housing, which costs less than site-built housing. And that way you don't end up in a dynamic where the rehab costs are more than the home's going to be worth in the end. And the powers that be do not know who owns them. Absolutely, that can be a problem too, often called heirs property or tangled title, where a home is owned by multiple people, maybe many people, because it was inherited by multiple children of parents who are deceased. And sometimes their children can end up inheriting it also. And that's a tricky situation to unwind. There are sort of specialty policy fixes for those tangled title heirs property situations. And I don't know if Delaware's adopted it. There are a number of states that have adopted something called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act to make it easier to deal with sites like that. But that's a tricky situation if there's a question of who owns a home. But look, there are homes that have tangled titles in Minneapolis too, and in New Rochelle, and in Portland, and Tysons, right? So that doesn't explain the variation between jurisdictions. And okay, there's a tangled title bill now going through the legislature. So that doesn't explain the variation between jurisdictions, but that is a problem worth resolving in its own right. And it can help get a little bit of housing back on the market that's otherwise not. So that's a plus. But it's, I don't think there's potential for that to be sort of a game changer in the way that legalizing apartments on corridors by right is, because the places that have improved affordability the most are those that have made it easiest to build, not those that have resolved their title issues, even though resolving their title issues is worthwhile on its own. If we look at New York, within the state, the places that saw the slowest rent growth, White Plains and New Rochelle on the left, are those that added the most housing, that made it easiest to build. The places with the fastest rent growth, those on the right, are those that added the least housing, that didn't make those changes to make it easiest to build. So look, there's a question of what change means. The places on the left, they did change their buildings. They didn't change their existing buildings. I mean, they added on to their housing stock by allowing new apartments on commercial corridors, downtown, near their train stations. And that means they got to keep their people because they didn't displace them since they kept rent growth down. When rents go up 37%, rents go up 45%, inevitably that means displacement. Because if you don't allow new buildings, you lose your people. They get changed out because there isn't room for everybody. it's possible to have room for everybody. And the jurisdictions on the left are showing what that looks like to make room for everybody, to allow enough housing. And they've also, these places on the left are about the fastest growing jurisdictions in New York State, economically dynamic, in a stronger fiscal situation, because new apartments are a plus for economic development. Infrastructure costs are lower when people live closer to each other. You know, a mile of sewer is kind of a mile of sewer. The question is how many people live on that
So what
mile.
day is good?
A mile of water is a mile of water. The question is how many people live on that mile. And so this has been a fiscal boon to those jurisdictions, but also it's all but stopped rent growth because they've made it easier to build, and they've made it easier to build near jobs and near stores and near transit. So even though rents going up is rough across the board for the roughly 34% of US households who rent, it's regressive. It hurts low-income households the most, and it's not even close. When there aren't enough homes out there, high-income people tend to move into middle-income neighborhoods because they need to find a place to live. And if there are no homes available in high-income neighborhoods, then they outbid residents of middle-income neighborhoods. Residents of middle-income neighborhoods, when they're looking for somewhere to live, tend to move into low-income neighborhoods. They need to find a place to live. They can outbid residents of low-income neighborhoods. Residents of low-income neighborhoods have nowhere left to go. We see more homelessness. We see more displacement. We see more eviction. But most commonly, we see steep rent increases. People tolerating 62% rent increases that they really can't afford. So even though the housing shortage has done damage across the board, it hurts low-income households most. Sometimes there's concern that building could displace people, could cause problems for low-income residents. Not building is not an option. Not building hurts low-income households most because it makes them compete for their own homes.
Alex, I'm so sorry. Can I, and I'm not putting this in the chat.
Please.
I just think that farthest left, can you just explain the 61.9%, like what that means?
Yeah.
Before you move on, because it's just very startling, and I just kind of want to emphasize what that's saying.
Yeah, so we took all of the zip codes in the US that are in Zillow, because Zillow keeps good rent data month by month, and they have pretty broad coverage. So then we segmented those zip codes by their median income in census. And so we see that the lowest income quarter of neighborhoods during the 7-year period had an average 61.9% rent increase. The highest income quarter of neighborhoods had a 43.9% rent increase. So look, the shortage means that everybody's rent goes up, but not the same amount. Shortages are regressive. They hurt low-income households most because they have nowhere left to turn. And when they're out of options, they're out of options. And that creates sort of what's effectively a turbocharged landlord's market, because scarcity gets the most severe in low-income areas when there aren't enough homes. So they had a 61.9% average rent increase versus 43.9% rent increase in the highest income quarter of neighborhoods. So this is what a shortage looks like. Now, what about the opposite? What if a lot of housing comes online, enough to actually push rents down? Well, looking at data from another data provider, RealPage, in 2023, we saw a wave of apartments come online. These are projects that got going when interest rates were really low in 2020 and 2021. And because there were so many new apartments in the 6 cities you're seeing on the screen, rents went down year over year in all of them, not even inflation adjusted, like rents just went down. You got your renewal notice from your landlord, and it said, we would like to cut your rent so that you stay in your apartment. So, hey, look, that's good news. That means the market's working the way that we think it does. This is what we would expect. But most striking to me on here is that Class C rents dropped the most. They dropped more than Class A rents. So Class A is new fancy buildings. You got a pool on the roof. Maybe there's a yoga room, a dog wash. It's above Whole Foods. I don't know. So, right, new fancy building, Class A. Class C, these are older apartments. They usually don't have amenities. They've been around for a while. Low and moderate income households usually don't live in Class A apartments. They tend to live in Class B and C apartments. Class A apartments is mostly higher income residents, upper middle class residents who want a higher end place and can afford it. So why did rents drop the most for Class C? Why didn't they drop the most for Class A if Class A is the new housing stock? Well, when there are enough homes, those middle income residents who are pushing into low income neighborhoods can suddenly have a bit of breathing room. They can push back out of low income neighborhoods, and they do. Those middle income neighborhoods that saw the influx of high income residents, well, those high income residents now have somewhere to go because there are all these new fancy buildings coming online. And the way that this works, an economist who's at Notre Dame now did work on what he called moving chains. And when a new building opens up in a high income neighborhood, yeah, you're right. The people who move into it have high incomes. But the units they vacate tend to be occupied by people whose incomes are a little lower. The units they vacate tend to be occupied by people whose incomes are a little lower. The units that they vacate tend to be occupied by people whose incomes are a little lower. So we absolutely see that adding housing of any type to the market takes pressure off of the older, naturally affordable housing stock. And so even though new Class C buildings weren't getting built, Class C rents went down the most. Got a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to check those out. All right. Certain states like Texas, Pennsylvania, an abandoned house can be claimed through a legal process of conservatorship through an Abandoned and Blighted Property Conservatorship Act. Mainly community development nonprofits can be appointed conservators to rehabilitate the properties. Cool. Yeah, that's good news to get more housing online that way. Rachel, I'm very curious if there's a big difference in this trend when you are in a community that has a high influx of new residents of high incomes. So these are places where we would expect the biggest impacts, in a place where you're in a community with a high influx of new residents with high incomes, because that's where there's the most pressure on the housing stock. So I'm going to show another slide focused on Austin. So let me address that question when I get there, since it's right on the money. So here we go, Austin. And I want to say at the outset, look, I know interest rates are high, and that is suppressing housing production. I know costs in general have gotten higher for materials, for labor. It's not just interest rates, and that suppresses production. But local policy and state policy matter so much more than interest rates and construction materials and labor costs. San Francisco and Austin here are side by side. San Francisco famously does not make it very easy to build housing. Austin has taken some significant steps in the last few years and made it much easier to build housing. Apartments on corridors, they've eliminated their parking minimums. They're allowing starter homes. They've cut their permitting times by more than half. So much easier to build in Austin and San Francisco because of local policy. And to a small degree, state policy is a factor also in California in suppressing housing production. So in 2022, interest rates were low, right? This should be the boom time for new housing coming online. Well, Austin was producing housing at more than 7 times the rate of San Francisco per capita. 2023, okay, this is when interest rates peaked in August of 2023. And yes, housing production went down in both cities because higher interest rates do suppress housing production. But the difference between cities is much, much bigger than the difference between years. So if it were interest rates that were the main driver of housing production, we would expect to see low production in both cities in these years. But we're not. It's state and local policy that make the bigger difference. So even in 2023, when interest rates were high, Austin was issuing permits at 10x the rate of San Francisco. Because Austin has been building so much housing and made it so easy to build, their rents are down, inflation adjusted, 24% since the summer of 2022. 24% decline in real rents. Unsurprisingly, homelessness rose in San Francisco during this time period, homelessness rose in the US during this time period, and homelessness fell modestly in Austin during this time period. So state and local policy are the most important factor in determining the level of housing production, more so than interest rates or construction costs. Oh, Rachel, to your previous question, Austin saw a wave of kind of tech jobs starting really in 2019, 2020, and so had a lot of high-income residents moving in. So rents soared there from 2017 to 2022. And in response, the city made it much easier to build. More homes started coming online, and rents dropped after they had gone up after an influx of high-income residents due to tech jobs basically moving in. Okay, so homelessness. Overall, most people going through homelessness, typically it's 76 to 78%, have been homeless for less than a year. All-time high in homelessness right now in the US, but this is part of the housing market. And so the reason why we know that it's housing costs that drive homelessness is because there's extreme variation between jurisdictions, but it's because people are cycling in and out of homelessness. And when people fall off the housing ladder, because there's no bottom rung, and they end up without a home, these are people who were recently housed. Sometimes they were on a lease, sometimes they weren't, but they are recently in housing. And so housing dynamics are a huge driver of homelessness overall. Not to pick on Phoenix and Tucson, but we're doing some research on Arizona anyway. And these jurisdictions had a big influx of residents. Again, a lot of people are getting priced out of California because they're not building homes there. And so they're moving into other states like Arizona. That puts pressure on housing stock in those states. And Phoenix and Tucson just didn't build enough housing to keep up. They both have fairly restrictive zoning. So rents soared and homelessness soared. In contrast, Houston and Minneapolis were making it much easier to build, and they did. They had some policy changes. Houston to legalize starter homes, Minneapolis, as we discussed, to allow apartments on corridors. And so they held down rent growth in those jurisdictions, and rents were dropping in Houston and Minneapolis at the exact same time they were soaring in Phoenix and Tucson. Even within Minnesota, we look at Minneapolis compared to the rest of the state. On the left, you see Minneapolis was producing housing at triple the rate of the rest of the state during this time period. And so what does negative homelessness mean? This is just change in direction. So like a 12% decline in homelessness means if you used to have, let's say, 1,000 people going through homelessness, and now you have 880, that's a 12% drop. So this is just the change in homelessness. Is it going up or is it going down? Well, in Minneapolis, it was going down. It went down. In the rest of Minnesota, it went up because rents were under control in Minneapolis and they were going up in the rest of the state. From 2017 to 2023, in 2017, it took 80% of the area median income to afford the median rent in Minneapolis. By 2023, because incomes were still rising, but rents weren't, it only took 66% of the area median income to afford the median rent in Minneapolis. If you're saying, hey, 66% AMI, we subsidize that, that's the median rent in Minneapolis because they're on their 9th straight year without rent increases right now. Their 9th straight year without rent increases because they have made it easy to build apartments. And that has made all the difference. They just released new data this spring from their point in time count on homelessness they did in January. Homelessness went down again because they're making it easy to build. Now, look, there's more needed. That's not all there is to it, but the availability of housing is what drives rents, and rents are what drive homelessness. even for voucher holders, people who have a Section 8 housing choice voucher, the amount of housing available in the market is a primary driver of whether they find a home. In tight markets, where there aren't enough rentals out there, only 61% of voucher holders find a place at all. In loose markets, places that have more housing supply, it's 80%. So to put it another way, the rate of people with a voucher who fail to find any home is double in a tight market what it is in a loose market. And people find homes faster too when they have a voucher. So even if our focus is on voucher holders, people whose incomes are low enough to qualify for a voucher and need this kind of support to afford a place to live, the amount of housing out there in the market is a primary determinant of whether they find a home at all. Let's look at Houston and Dallas. We see Houston in blue, Dallas in red. Rents have gone up much faster in Dallas than in Houston, going back to 2015. And so because Houston has held rent growth lower than income growth during this time period, homelessness has declined, while homelessness went up a bit in Dallas during this time period, even though, right, these are the two biggest cities in the same state. There's going to be a lot of overlap in policies. Certainly any state policy is the same. And that difference in rent growth amounted to more than $2,600 a year. So if rents had gone up in Houston at the same rate as Dallas, people would be spending more than $2,600 a year in rent. That is absolutely enough to drive someone into homelessness who's living close to the edge. The most recent big study, national study we have on homelessness finds that a $100 increase in median rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness in a market. And the reverse is true also. When we can push rents down, we can see homelessness drop in tandem. Allowing more housing also reduces displacement. So if we look at the four biggest cities in the US, New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, well, 3 of them lost Black residents during the first 2 decades of this century. And it was the ones that didn't allow enough housing, because that scarcity pushes people into competition with each other. And the racial wealth gap means that Black households are more likely to lose out. So the only city here that added Black residents was Houston. Houston also added Hispanic residents at a faster clip, because in the same way that shortages are regressive, allowing enough homes for everybody reduces competition between residents, and there can be enough room for everybody. Displacement isn't necessary. Housing markets don't have to be zero sum. Everyone can have a place. That's pretty much how the US was through most of the 20th century. There could be a place for everyone. That's not the case anymore, because the shortage has gotten so severe that we see displacement when there aren't enough homes, and that disproportionately affects low-income households, Black households, renters, younger residents, because they haven't bought a home yet. Harris County, Houston also has low zoning regulation, as well as the state is investing in high-income job training. Yeah, Houston does not have zoning. That's right. Harris County outside Houston does. So talking about roughly half of population of the county here that does, and half that doesn't outside and inside the city. But overall, Houston made it much easier to build, because Houston used to have a 5,000 square foot lot size minimum, and they dropped that to 1,400 square feet. And once they did, they got 80,000 townhomes out of it. So they've held down rent growth in Houston, even relative to their prior land use policy. So Raleigh's another example. Look on the left, we see from 2017 to 2021, okay, you can see Raleigh was adding 3,000 and change homes a year. Then they enacted land use reforms, and they made it much easier to build apartments, cottage courts, townhouses, 2 and 3 unit homes, accessory dwelling units. Once they did that, they saw their housing production shoot up to more than 5,000 homes a year. Well, rents had been going up at 7% a year before the change. After the change, they've been going up at 3% a year. So still rising, but now incomes have a chance to keep up. So, and this is just straight point in time count, Raleigh, during the first 5 years we looked at, saw an increase in homelessness of 650 people in the city. The most recent 3 years, they saw a decline in homelessness of 542 people in the city because there are more homes. And the foremost driver of homelessness is that there aren't enough homes, which leads to rents going up quickly. And so Raleigh is just another kind of case study, like Minneapolis, like Austin, like Houston, it as a place that they made reforms, more homes got built, rent growth slowed, homelessness had been going up, then it started going down. So we've been talking about cities, but we're seeing not just city action at this point, but states getting involved too. We've seen, gosh, I haven't tallied up this session yet. Going into the session, we have 14 states have legalized accessory dwelling units, and several more have now done it, including Maryland. And that is one of the reforms that is taking off in states, to legalize accessory dwelling units. So like a basement, backyard, or garage apartment that is built usually on the same lot as a single family home. Probably the most impactful change we're seeing is legalizing multifamily housing apartments in commercial areas, so on commercial corridors. And that's right, that's what all these cities have done more or less, that I've shown you, that have improved rental affordability. So now we're seeing states do it too. Florida, California, Montana, Hawaii. And this session, it looks like bills to help that happen will be signed or have gotten to the governor's desk in Texas and Connecticut. New Hampshire is close. And Colorado and Arizona did a version of this too last year. Also streamlining permit approval processes and requiring much simpler permitting is very popular with the public, but it's also an effective way to get more housing built. And we're seeing state laws now to require simplified permitting at the local level and require more housing types that can be built by right. So that means it's essentially automatic, and the jurisdiction grants the permit based on whether the builder followed the rules. They don't have, a series of public hearings. They don't have votes on whether people's homes are allowed to be built. If you comply with the rules, your permit is granted because they already have rules and you're following them as a builder. We're seeing building code reforms, including legalizing manufactured housing. So a lot of construction costs are driven by building codes. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Limiting parking mandates, because parking is a major driver of housing costs. And parking mandates end up being hugely regressive because the bottom quarter of households by wealth, about a third of them don't own a car at all, but they're forced to pay for parking because parking costs are usually bundled with rent, even though a third of the lowest quarter households by wealth don't have a car. Enabling home sharing so that roommates are treated like families for purposes of occupancy limits, and co-living so that people can share, kind of share kitchens and bathrooms and are allowed to live in dorm style housing, which has often been banned. So this was rare. Like, it was very unusual for states to pass laws like these from 2012 to 2016. We saw an average of one law a year in the whole country. 2017, 2022, 18 laws a year in the whole country. The last two sessions, an average of 48. I suspect we will see more than 48 that end up being signed from this session in 2025. This is just a game changer because it moves the conversation from the local level to the state level. The cost benefit analysis is pretty different at the state level. A couple dozen very loud, usually homeowners, sometimes can stop something at the local level. That tends not to be the case at the state level because the state policymakers are thinking about the well-being of the whole state and also are responsible for all of the spending that has to occur when there aren't enough homes. Rental assistance, spending on homelessness, spending on infrastructure, which gets strained by people being pushed further and further out from the places they want to live every day. Okay, Kimberly, all this vacant housing that can be utilized for housing, reduce homelessness, and reduce rental costs would not exist in Houston. Okay, so a place like Houston that has low housing costs generally has higher vacancy rates than a place than places that are expensive. So vacancy rates tend to be highest in places that are most affordable, right? So a place like Austin, where we've seen the vacancy rate go up, because the vacancy rate is the rental availability rate. But certainly, yeah, there can be blighted housing also, which needs to be replaced. But we're seeing this conversation move from the local level to the state level. And that has meant that policymakers think about it differently. How can I attract companies to my state? You have to have homes for the employees. How can I avoid the record homelessness that a lot of states are seeing? You have to have enough homes. How can we get our infrastructure costs down? We got to stop forcing people to drive 30 and 40 miles every day to get to work, to get to their kids' school, to get to do errands, and let them live close to the places they go every day to reduce traffic, reduce wear and tear on roads, improve air quality by reducing pollution, and reduce transportation costs, which are often the number two item in a household's budget after housing. So building code reforms, we're seeing some states move 3 and 4 unit buildings or 3 and 6 unit buildings under their residential code, their single family code, because it costs about 10% less to build under the single family code than the multifamily code. Studying or allowing one staircase for 4 to 6 story buildings on small lots. This is something that 8 states have done going into the session. We are likely to see 6 states from this session with new laws to either legalize, authorize, or study allowing small apartment buildings of 4 to 6 stories with up to 4 units per floor to have one staircase instead of 2, which cuts construction costs by 6 to 13%. And legalizing micro units or co-housing wherever multifamily housing is allowed, or for commercial buildings that are converted into housing. Talking about parking, Buffalo completely eliminated parking minimums in 2017. So did Hartford. They were the first 2 cities to do it. Seattle has eliminated parking minimums downtown. And most of the new housing built in those cities after they got rid of those parking minimums could not have been built before. It was being blocked by parking mandates. Even if the homes were near transit, even if the residents didn't have cars, even if they were college students without cars, even if they were seniors who didn't drive anymore, parking had to be built. And parking mandates drive housing production. This state, this year, has been easily the most consequential for parking reform in the country. Connecticut has a bill at the governor's desk that will eliminate residential parking mandates in Connecticut for nearly all homes. Builders will still build parking because there's demand for it, but parking mandates won't be driving housing. Washington and Montana passed very far-reaching parking mandate reductions this session that will mean for most new homes in cities and towns, no parking is required in those states. Texas's law that's on the governor's desk to legalize apartments on commercial corridors caps parking mandates at 1 spot per unit. A lot of jurisdictions require 1.5 or 2 spots per unit, or depending on the number of bedrooms. But look, even in Seattle and Buffalo, where no parking is required, most builders still build it because people want parking, but they probably want less. And this way, parking is based on actual demand for it and what can fit on site. And parking is not driving whether housing is allowed. So I mentioned the one staircase thing. 14 states coming out of this session have passed laws or have law on the governor's desk right now to allow one staircase instead of requiring 2 for small apartment buildings. This makes a big difference. This means apartment buildings can fit above stores. Part of why we don't get traditional main streets anymore is actually because of the 2-stair requirement. Because the 2-stair requirement means apartment buildings have to be much wider than they are with 1 stair. And you have a corridor connecting them, so you only get units on one side, which is why we mostly get studios and 1-bedrooms now, with 2 bedrooms on the end. We used to get more 2 and 3-bedroom apartments. The 2-stair requirement is why we don't get them anymore. It's also why we don't get apartments above stores as much as we used to, because of the 2-stair requirement. Allowing 1 stair means that you can have compact apartment buildings with a range of layouts, and they can fit on smaller lots. When I say legalize apartments on commercial corridors, to Rachel's question, this means that building an apartment building on commercially zoned land is a by right use. So that means it's not conditional. You don't need a variance to do it. You don't need to have a vote of the zoning commission or the city council to find out if you're allowed to build an apartment building. It's a by right use, which means it would be approved administratively by municipal staff instead of having a series of hearings and votes and variances around it. And that makes it much less expensive and easier to build. Exactly. So Rachel says, if you can build a Kohl's there, you can build an apartment building there. Exactly. If you can have a 5-story office building, you can have a 5-story apartment building. If you can have a CVS on a corridor, you can put some apartments over the CVS. It doesn't just have to be CVS.
Alex, there's some questions in the chat about safety. Does the 2-stair requirement have to do with fire exit requirements? And my question is similar. Does 1 stair mean less safe?
Yep, great. So 2 questions about fire safety, and you are on the right track. Good thinking. That is why the 2-stair requirement was implemented. It was before we had smoke alarms, before we had sprinklers, before we had fire rated walls and self-closing doors. So because apartments weren't that safe, the idea was, well, let's give people 2 chances to get out if there's a fire instead of having 1. And there are still people who are concerned that having 1 stair means that apartment buildings would be less safe because people would have 1 way out. So we had to answer that question empirically. But first, the reason why this can add so much housing is because it cuts construction costs 6 to 13%. Stairways have gotten really expensive to build in multifamily buildings. It also means you can use a small lot to build an apartment building instead of having to assemble multiple parcels to get a bigger, bulkier, wider building to fit the 2 stairs and the corridor, and to have kind of a hotel-like building with units on both sides, which is mandated now for buildings over 3 stories. So fire safety, is it safe? Well, we hand-coded every single fire death in New York City and Seattle, the 2 US cities that have that legalized single-stair buildings. Several decades ago, New York City has over 4,400 of them. And the fire death rate in single-stair buildings versus other homes in New York City, the exact same. 5 per million residents per year. But all 3 fire deaths in single-stair buildings occurred in unit in the apartment, and the fire did not spread beyond the unit of origin. So we can know with certainty that the lack of a second staircase didn't cause any fire deaths, 0. Looking at more than 600,000 occupant years of experience in New York City single-stair buildings. We looked at Seattle also, same story. And we looked at 12 years of data, the most recent 12 years, that's how far back we can go with publicly available kind of reliable fire death data that shows building type. And Seattle had 1 fire death in a single-stair building. It occurred in unit, and the fire did not spread beyond the unit of origin. So we know there were 0 fire deaths caused by having a 1 stair instead of 2. But there's more. We also hand-coded the fire deaths in Delaware. And Delaware, where single family, including duplex and manufactured, is 84% of the housing stock, single family homes had 93% of the fire deaths in Delaware from the start of January 2019 to when we first compiled this data for Delaware this past fall. And old multifamily buildings built in 1999 or earlier, 11% of the housing stock, 7% of the fire deaths. New multifamily built since 2000, that's 5% of the housing stock, not 1 fire death. So we've done this same analysis for a lot of states at this point. Every single one, we really see the same pattern. New multifamily is consistently the safest. So because all single-stair buildings would be modern multifamily, we can say with confidence, legalizing 1-stair buildings would improve fire safety. It would reduce fire deaths because it would take the pressure off of the older homes and let people live in the safest type of housing which is modern multifamily. The requirement for a second staircase is part of what is holding back construction of modern multifamily buildings, the safest type. So I'm going to move to kind of the last major topic. And the US had roughly no homelessness 50 years ago. Homelessness is new. And really from the end of the Great Depression to the late 1970s, the US had about no homelessness. It was extremely rare. So what we had then were what were called SROs, or single room occupancies. They were about 1/10 of the rental housing stock in major cities. Now, for somebody living at the poverty line in the US, a one-person household in 2025, the rent that would be affordable at that level using 30% of income is $391. Adjusting SRO rents from 100 years ago to $2025, the median monthly rent for an SRO would be about $230 a month. Something even someone could afford living below the poverty line. The median one-bedroom rent in the US right now is over $1,200. So it's pretty easy to see why, as we lost our stock of SROs because of bans on them and updated zoning codes and building codes that effectively prohibited them, we got homelessness instead, because the type of housing that was prevalent that people could afford was no longer available. Question, have you done a study of college towns and how the university interacts with the town in regards to affordable housing? So one way to improve affordability is to make it easier and encourage colleges and universities to build dorms for students on campus, because that takes a lot of pressure off the surrounding housing stock. If they don't do that, students, staff spill into the community, and that puts pressure on the housing stock. One way to simplify this is also to let landlords kind of make more efficient use of their homes and let people be roommates who want to live together. A lot of municipalities, a lot of college towns cap the number of unrelated people who can live together at 2, 3, or 4. So that means bedrooms go wasted, even while there's a housing shortage. Overall, there is a record number of empty bedrooms in the US right now, even while we have a record housing shortage. Housing is being wasted. And part of the reason is local regulatory barriers prohibiting people from being roommates. So we are seeing states pass laws, sometimes called Golden Girls laws, to allow people to live together who are not family. So this is a story from the Washington Post on Friday, looking at DC, but also they looked at San Francisco and Chicago. Ooh, goodness. So this is about a new building in DC. It's going up, subsidized housing, with a development cost of $1.2 million per unit. We're seeing this in San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles, increasingly common in California. Look, we need something new, a new approach. This is not sustainable. There's no way that we can subsidize our way out of this. We have to build our way out, but we can't have apartments that cost $1.2 million for subsidized housing. Even high-end market rate housing usually costs substantially less than that to build. So the new idea I wanted to flag today, we're doing research for the architecture firm Gensler on converting offices into co-living, so dorm-style housing. And the US has a record amount of vacant office space right now, over 1 billion square feet. We've got a roughly 20% office vacancy rate in US metros. So converting offices into dorm-style housing instead of regular apartments costs 2 to 4 times less per unit, because you leave the plumbing in the middle, and that sharply reduces construction costs, and you leave fixed windows in place, and you roughly triple the number of units on the floor by doing dorm-style housing. This could be actual dorms for college students, for grad students, university staff, but it also could just be housing for anybody. So like a nicer version of what were 20th century SRO, single room occupancies. Here's a building from Denver. And you can see around the perimeter, those are all the units. So this is a 30-story building. Ground floor can be retail, lobby, second floor can be amenities, office space. top 28 floors could be housing. You could get more than 1,200 units out of a building like this, but it's not going to work as regular apartments. The floors aren't the right shape. The space is too far from the windows. The plumbing is in the wrong place. But as dorm style housing, works much, much better. You can get 3 times as many units for a cost that is a quarter to a third lower. And because of that, you can have low rents. We're showing the median rent here in blue for these 3 cities. These are the first 3 we studied, and what we project the rents could be for dorm style housing. Affordable in every city we've looked at, 35 to 50% of the area median income for these units with modest subsidies. So in Denver, $850 a month, including utilities, where the median rent is $1,771. Minneapolis, that's $750 a month. Seattle, $1,000. It's hard to find a place in Seattle for $1,000 a month. And these are places that people could live while minimizing transportation costs because they're near jobs and near transit. People could be car free or car light. And the subsidies required are drastically lower. So that headline I showed you from the Washington Post about several cities that are spending roughly $1 million in subsidies for some low-income apartments. In Denver, this could be done for about $23,000 a unit in subsidy and have it be affordable at 35% of the area median income. That's obviously a game changer. Denver, it's typical now that they spend about $300,000 in subsidy per unit. So you could get 12 or 13 times as much housing for the same spending and do something with your vacant office space to revitalize downtowns. The stuff I'm showing you today, for the most part, is it works, but it's not a silver bullet. This one is kind of halfway to a silver bullet because it's very quick and it can produce a ton of housing quickly. You also can master lease floors. So like one floor could be affiliated with a university, and a university master leases a floor. Another floor is master leased by a hospital, a healthcare center, a school system. So you can have master leased floors. So you have a connection between residents, and it's not just people that don't know each other living together. It's people who have some connection, and you can have the building work that way also. Lastly, the policies I'm sharing today are mostly quite popular with the public. And you can see there's really not much difference in support between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Now, people who go to community meetings sometimes are a little different in terms of their views about whether to allow enough housing and whether there should be enough homes for everybody. So I want to recognize that and suggest that the way we gather feedback really matters. When jurisdictions do proactive outreach, they tend to find a lot of support for allowing more homes. When they hold 6 and 8 hour community meetings, the people who show up tend to be demographically different than their communities overall. We don't see a lot of hourly workers who go to a 6-hour community meeting. We don't see a lot of people with young kids who go to a 6-hour community meeting. We don't see a lot of people who are precariously housed. We don't even see a lot of renters. And so I want to recognize that the way we gather feedback and whether it's systematic matters for the feedback that we get about whether to allow more homes, but broadly, housing reforms are popular across the board. My email address is here if you have questions, but we can do Q&A, and also I can share a copy of the slides from today. But let me stop there so we can chit chat a bit.
Thank you, Alex. That was a lot of information and really, really helpful. So I appreciate it. I do have a question. Can you describe something other than the very residential public hearings that we have on a regular basis throughout Delaware that would be a better, and not so detailed, but it'll give us a picture in our mind of what would be a more accurate gathering of information tool?
Sure. So certainly surveys are a way to do it. And when we want to know what public opinion is, we usually do a survey. Those are accurate and that way everyone has a chance to be included. And that means feedback will be more representative of the community. Also, doing proactive outreach is great. So we don't have to wait for people to come to us and commit more time than they may have available to a community meeting. and jurisdictions can do proactive outreach to find out what residents think. And I was talking with the former mayor of New Rochelle, New York, which he oversaw the biggest upzoning in New York State to allow more homes. Then they had the fastest housing growth and the slowest rent growth. And he said, when we did community meetings and we looked at social media posts and looked at the comments on them, yikes, you would have thought nobody wanted more housing. Then we went and did proactive outreach and talked to people who didn't come to those and who didn't comment on social media and asked what they thought. And most of them liked the idea. And he said also, look, I mean, I ran for election after we allowed thousands of apartments in the town, and he was reelected easily. And he noted that the more pro-development candidates consistently been reelected in his jurisdiction. So we do have ways to gather feedback that are not waiting for people to come to long community meetings. Surveys are one, proactive outreach is another. And gathering feedback when you do your comprehensive plan, initial zoning, makes all the sense in the world. But we're seeing that the state laws that are being passed usually require that the types of housing that are legalized can be built by right. And so that means once you make your plans, you have a comprehensive plan, you have your zoning, you have a set of laws, you follow them. And if somebody submits a permit request to build something that's allowed, they can build it. And that is approved administratively instead of having a series of meetings and votes about each apartment building.
Thank you. So at this point, I want to encourage others to put either questions or in the chat. And also Alex had said before, since he's not showing slides anymore, if you want to come off mute, feel free to do that as well if that's easier. But this is our opportunity to really gain information from Alex, who is a wealth of information of best practices across the state, so we can have a really serious conversation about what we could be doing better in Delaware. So I invite people to put a question in the chat or to come off mute.
I had a question. I'm often reminded of a case that I studied when I was in my master's program called the Mount Laurel decision. And why is it that, we can't require builders to, have a certain percentage of units within their developments that would be aimed at, people of lower AMI? They did it in New Jersey, I don't say that it was totally successful, but, why can't we, push for certain legislation like that? And if, not allow like the builders to sell different rights and things like that to, they shouldn't be able to do that. It should have to be like a, what do you call that, a PUD, where they have a mix of different uses, different types of homes, towns and apartments and singles and whatever, and offer, more than just these big, colossal homes, that most people can't afford. I don't see enough like that. Delaware does have some where it's built like that, but I would say, that there's probably more that are built just on single family homes rather than like that type of a situation where the housing reaches to everybody and not
Right.
just a certain income level.
Okay, great. I hear you. So question right about inclusionary zoning and about large single family that is not affordable. So usually when large single family is the only thing getting built in an area, it's the only thing that's allowed in an area. That's just what happens most of the time. Builders can make more money doing 25 units an acre than they can doing 1 unit an acre. But if they're only allowed to do 1 unit an acre, then they build 1 unit an acre. 2 homes on half-acre lots are more profitable than 1 home on a 1 acre lot for a builder. 20 homes on a 20th of an acre lots that are kind of townhouses with backyards and detached garages or something, those produce more revenue because you're selling to 20 people instead of selling to 1. If you're only selling to 1, it's because you're usually only allowed to sell to 1. inclusionary zoning. So there are three ways to do it well, and then there's the way that it's usually done. The three ways to do it well. One is having a revolving loan fund. Revolving loan funds are great. A revolving loan fund means that there's a housing production trust fund or a revolving loan fund set up by a state or a jurisdiction, and then financing is made available to a builder at a below market rate, usually as an equity investor, sometimes it's debt. And so the builder gets financing on favorable terms, and in exchange, they agree to do a percentage of units as below market. That's a really successful model, and can mean you get more housing in addition to getting housing that's below market, because the builder is getting below market rate financing and more projects pencil. So that's one way to do it, and that tends to be a successful model. The second is for inclusionary zoning to be voluntary, and that way the builder is getting some benefit for doing below market rate units. And that means that they're only going to include below market rate units if it's worth their while. So you don't run into the risk of a project not happening at all because it's no longer profitable because of inclusionary zoning. And the third is if it's fully funded with, say, tax credits for doing inclusionary zoning. And so that way there's an offset for the money that the builder loses on the below market rate units. So those are the three good ways. And then the regular way is it is decreed that a builder must lose money on some units and offer them at a below market rate. That tends to be net negative for affordability because it means that fewer apartments get built. And we look at places like that in the past have done kind of stringent inclusionary zoning requirements: Portland, Maine, Honolulu, Portland, Oregon for certain buildings, and it hurt housing production. And so it probably worsened affordability because it meant there was less housing coming online, because the inclusionary zoning requirements meant that the builders were going to lose too much money on the below market rate units. And the rest of the units, which would normally be more expensive under inclusionary zoning, weren't enough to make up for it. So there was less housing overall, and that was net negative for affordability. So to your question, it is definitely possible to do this well through a revolving loan fund, through having it be voluntary, or through having it be fully funded with tax credits. But kind of just a straight inclusionary zoning mandate without those sort of mechanisms to make the housing still work is probably net negative for affordability because it means fewer apartments get built.
Thank you. Other questions? Anybody else have another question?
Alex, this is Derek Southard from Neighborhood Partners. Under your example of using a revolving loan fund, is that a public sector driven finance vehicle that you're referencing, I assume? And are in the instances where you observed it, was it coupled with private sector traditional financing as well, or was that revolving loan fund used to fund the entire project?
Yeah, yes. Yes, your first question is public sector, usually authorized by a state or county or city. And for the second part, it means that this is part of the capital stack. It's not all of the funding. So the below market rate investment might be a slice of the mezzanine, the equity position. So if you're looking at a typical project with where the developer is putting up 2.5%, the bank is doing 65% on the LTV, loan to value, and then you've got that middle 32.5%. The public sector might take a slice of that 32.5% in equity, or they might be offering debt at a below market rate loan for a piece of the 65% that would otherwise be bank issued debt on a 65% loan to value project.
And from what you've seen, were these revolving loan funds funded through like state bond issues, or were they driven by the municipality, state, county, and local government? I'm just curious.
It can be done either way. So sometimes it's just an allocation in the state budget to set up
Okay,
to
yeah.
set up the loan fund.
Mhm.
Other times there is a bond issuance that's part of it, and it can be done either way. I should say I'm not an expert on revolving loan funds, but Center for Public Enterprise is an expert on revolving loan funds, so they know how to set them up, even though I'm
Yeah.
not. But we've seen their success in places,
Okay.
and essentially, it sort of acts as a boost to LIHTC because,
Yeah.
right, low-income housing tax credit projects, there aren't enough tax credits to go around. So here's essentially a way that you can get more housing
Right.
with some of
Right.
it below market rate by offering having a revolving loan fund that makes projects pencil that otherwise wouldn't.
I see. Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Hi, yes, I have a question. Hi. Great presentation, by the way. Thank you so much. You explained a lot. I have a comment. I'm not sure. I guess it could be a question too, because I've heard this come up a few times. So when you mentioned about people, well, this is what what I'm seeing here in Delaware. Personally, and from people who call me, and then a couple of committees that I've sat on. So a few months ago, we were in a meeting with a housing developer, and he says 60% of new home that his business is constructing are being purchased by people who don't reside in the state of Delaware. And then I was on another, and these are people that are coming from like New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania who make a lot more money than some of our people starting out here in the state of Delaware. And he also spoke about rentals as well, that he's also seeing, I'm sorry, homes that are already constructed and people are buying the same thing. People are coming from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So then it is forcing people that are in Delaware who do earn a decent wage, but are looking for new homes. And I say this personally because my son and his wife have been going through this for like the last 4 years, that they make a really nice wage, but every home they go to look at, people are outbidding them by $50,000 or $60,000, and these are people from out of state. And I was even on one panel once, and they said, "Is there a way to like stop that?" And I'm like, "I don't think you can stop that from people moving." I mean, and so you explained, and in certain states, things weren't being built, so then people leave, and then when they leave, it pushes out our folks. So people like my son and my daughter-in-law who do have a decent wage, they're still renting a place that maybe someone else could be renting. Like, so how do you like even address things like that? Are there like incentives for builders that people can offer? Like, I know when people receive like subsidies, Section 8 and things of that nature, that oftentimes you'll get a preference. If you live or you work in the county, you might get a preference. So it kind of rates you a little higher on a list to get access to that benefit, that subsidy. Is there anything that could be done with developers and, as an incentive for them to consider people from the actual state first? So that's like a question. I don't.
Short answer, no. Um, the solution has been to allow enough homes for everybody. I mean, what Montana was going through this exact problem.
Okay.
And it doesn't take that many Californians moving in to take up all the available homes in Montana. So they passed some very meaningful housing laws at the state level to make it much easier to build homes. And rents are coming down there already. And so right now, look, this isn't something you can do anything about at the state level, so I usually don't talk about it in presentations. The median credit score for a newly originated mortgage in the US is over 770. Mortgage lending has never been tighter. Most people who are renting cannot qualify for a mortgage. So the only way that homes get built when mortgage credit is that tight is for cash buyers who are often investors to buy them, and then sometimes they rent them out. So that's a way that we get new housing online, which is better than not getting new housing online for sure. But overall, mortgage credit is much, much too tight. And going back to 20th century lending standards, where somebody with a good normal credit score, 705, 710, 715, can get a mortgage, and would go a long ways toward solving the problem you're talking about. Because some housing doesn't get built because the builders know that the people who would buy those starter homes can't qualify for a mortgage anyway, because lending is just so tight. And that is a real setback for housing affordability, that mortgage credit has been so severely restricted and is unavailable to people with kind of normal credit scores.
Mhm.
Now, look, I mentioned Houston, right? Houston's been the most successful city in the country getting starter homes. And so somebody with a middle income really can afford a home in Houston because they're built on small lots and they're producing so many of them. And so that's another way to do it too. But overall, there are just too many veto points in the process. So homes aren't getting built that should. But also mortgage lending is so tight that people who would buy starter homes often can't qualify for them anyway. And so they only get built as rentals because investors have cash and individual households don't, and they need a mortgage. But the GSEs and other mortgage lenders, government-sponsored enterprises, and other mortgage lenders and buyers are saying no, because we've never really restored access to mortgages that was lost from 2007 to 2009. It was appropriate to get rid of bad products, but not to knock out the bottom quarter to a third of mortgage borrowers.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat, just wondering about the government's ability to implement eminent domain on buildings or structures that are not being utilized that may not need as much funding to rehab or renovate for single-person families and families with children or even elderly.
So I don't see the role here really, because builders are willing to build homes, and sellers are willing to sell homes at the right price. The places that have improved affordability, Austin, where remember inflation adjusted rents are down 24% in less than 3 years. Minneapolis, which is on its 9th year without rents going up. Houston, that's enabled 80,000 starter homes. Raleigh, which boosted housing production by more than 60%. The way they've done it isn't through eminent domain. So we don't really have any place that's used eminent domain a lot that's been successful. And it doesn't seem necessary to have success, because we have models of places that have improved affordability and brought homeownership within reach. Texas this session has passed a lot of bills to make it easier to build. Connecticut this session, right, eliminating parking requirements, allowing apartments up to 9 units on commercial corridors. We've seen Maryland pass a strong accessory dwelling unit law. Maryland passed a study bill to look at single stair construction. We've seen Vermont make it easier to build accessory dwelling units. New Hampshire legalize apartments on commercial corridors. So we have models for success, and replicating those places can lead to success, because we know it's worked where it's been tried.
So I want to take this opportunity to thank you. There's a question, but then I'll wrap up afterwards, because I want to be respectful of your gift of your time and expertise, Alex. David Ford has a question in the chat.
Okay.
That just came in.
Dave asks, from my knowledge, other FHA loans allow credit scores down to 580, 620 depending on loan scenario. Do you mean the loan lending guidelines are strict for new construction specifically? Just want to clarify. Yeah, on paper, absolutely. In practice, it is awfully tough to get a mortgage these days. Self-employed people have a really hard time getting a mortgage, documenting their income, people with 1099s, people with student loans because of the debt to income ratio guidelines. Absolutely. There's nothing on paper saying somebody with a 700 credit score can't get a mortgage, but very few mortgages are going to people with credit scores below 720.
Thank you. Thank you. This is the third time I've had the privilege of learning from you, Alex, and each time I learn something new. It is really good news. There's a lot we could be doing in Delaware. And there's a lot we could be doing that we know works in other places. I want to challenge you all in the next 3 weeks, because we have 2 of the bills that Alex referenced. We have a chance of passing in the next 3 weeks. One is ADUs allowed across the state. And I could tell you from being in almost every single hearing, the number one reason for not allowing ADUs is there will not be enough parking in residential areas. We have got to stop thinking about cars more than we think about people. So I encourage you to write an email to your senator, to your House representative, and let them know that you're watching how they vote on the ADU bill that's being voted on as we speak. The other one is about tangled deeds. That one also is being considered in our legislature. If you want any more information about those bills or any others, my email is now in chat. Feel free to reach out. But mostly I want to suggest that we're going to have, we're finishing up the first year of a 2-year session, which means wherever bills stop now, they get to continue in the next year. We will have 6 months until January to do a whole lot of education about land use. So if you are part of a community, if you are part of a particular area, group of people who would like to bring in the information, if not Alex himself, to do some education about land use reform and how we can improve the situation here in Delaware, please reach out to me because we want to use this time well. So when we come back in January, we're ready to really transform things. Michael, we are going to have a slide on one of his state things in next, 10 years or so, showing how we reduced, right, the cost of rent and homelessness in the state of Delaware.
That's
That
an
can
amazing
only
goal.
happen.
I want to see us on one of Alex's slides. I love that goal.
That can only happen with each and every one of us working together. So thank you again, Alex, for all of your expertise and your time. And thank you to each and every one of you for coming. And please reach out. I look forward to working with you as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, Nicole. Nice to see you.
Yeah.